Dawn creeps across the low canopy of New Guinea, 1943. The air is thick, alive with mist and the scent of rot. A Japanese patrol moves through the vines, their uniforms slick with dew, rifles lifted against the green blur of leaves. They have learned to fear the jungle's silence, but not yet to understand it. To them, it is an ally, a veil against the enemy. Every step is rehearsed, every sound is swallowed before it can escape. Then, without warning, the silence folds in on itself. A single blast, deep, concussive, echoes like thunder trapped beneath the trees. The first man falls backward before his finger touches the trigger. His helmet spins once, then settles into the mud. Another shot follows, sharper, closer. The jungle flinches, vines trembling from the shockwave. The survivors freeze. Their training tells them to seek the source, to counterattack, but the echoes betray nothing. The gunfire doesn't roll across distance, it erupts inside it. A third blast tears through the mist, scattering bark and breath alike. The jungle, once a labyrinth of safety, becomes a trap of invisible walls. When the smoke clears, 3 men lie still, their bodies shredded in ways unfamiliar to war. There are no neat bullet holes, no clear trajectory, only torn cloth, scattered metal, and the heavy scent of powder. The weapon, whatever it was, fired from a distance too short for calculation, too brutal for response. A shadow shifts behind a fallen palm. A U.S. Marine emerges, slow and deliberate. His weapon gleams wet in the filtered light. Short-barreled, pump-action, simple. He kneels, ejects a shell, and feeds another into the chamber with the rhythm of habit. There is no rush, no panic, only precision. The patrol's survivors retreat into the brush, shaken by what they cannot name. They had expected rifles. They had expected range. What met them instead was thunder at 10 yards, a weapon from another age, resurrected in the heart of the jungle. The Marine glances toward the stillness, listening. Then, almost to himself, he whispers, "The shotgun works here." Fade to black, a calm before understanding. The weapon's name has yet to be spoken, but its legend has begun. The weapon was older than the men who carried it. A Winchester model, 1897, born in the trenches of France, forged in mud and blood, and left behind when the world decided war had become modern. Its design was simple, a wooden stock, a short steel barrel, and a pump that spoke in rhythm rather than words. It was not elegant, it was not new, but in the jungles of the Pacific, it found resurrection. The model 1897 fired a 12-gauge shell, packed with 9 lead pellets. Within 25 yards, it turned the air into shrapnel. Where rifles offered precision, the shotgun offered certainty. Its sound was distinct, unmistakable. A metallic click, a pump, then a thunderclap that ended arguments instantly. In the open plains of Europe, it had been outpaced by machine guns and mortars, but in the choking green of New Guinea, it became the perfect answer to a question the modern army had forgotten to ask. What happens when war becomes intimate again? Japanese soldiers had trained for distance and discipline. They had studied rifle marksmanship, swordsmanship, and the sacred charge. Every motion was ritualized, every tactic rooted in honor. The shotgun defied all of it. There was no ritual in its firing, only reflex. There was no glory in its effect, only finality. Reports began to circulate among Japanese officers, descriptions of a weapon that tore through foliage and flesh with equal ease. Some called it barbaric, unworthy of a soldier's hand. Others whispered of its efficiency and feared it. In a doctrine built on spirit and steel, the American shotgun was an insult to philosophy itself. For the Marines who carried it, there was no debate. The shotgun was not barbarism, it was adaptation. It did not belong to time or tradition, It belonged to the battlefield that demanded it. By the time the enemy labeled it dishonorable, it was already too late. In the Pacific, war no longer cared for honor, only survival, and this relic from another century had returned to remind them both what survival sounded like. Guadalcanal. The name would come to define the turning of the Pacific War, but for the men on the ground, it was not strategy or maps that decided survival. It was distance, and in the jungle, distance ceased to exist. The terrain closed around them like a living thing, humid, tangled, suffocating. Every step was swallowed by mud, every sound by foliage. There were no front lines, no horizons, no warnings. One moment, the world was still. The next, it erupted in screams. Firefights were measured not in yards, but in feet. Marines learned quickly what theory never taught. Their rifles, designed for range and accuracy, jammed under the wet film of rot. Submachine guns overheated and choked on mud. But one weapon refused to fail. The shotgun, simple, short, unpretentious, worked every time. It didn't care about mud. It didn't need precision. It asked only that a man stand his ground and pump the action once more. At first, commanders had viewed it as a novelty, a relic carried by men who preferred comfort over doctrine. But after the first close engagements, reports began to change in tone. The shotgun was not a supplement, it was survival itself. In the shadows between trees, its roar cut through confusion, clearing the unseen. Japanese soldiers, disciplined and fearless, often charged with bayonets fixed. They believed distance was courage, that the final yards of a charge were sacred. But at 2 yards, courage meant nothing. Buckshot shredded formations mid-run, each shell a storm of lead that ended motion before thought. One Marine remembered, "They thought we'd fight at 20 yards. We fought at 2. The lesson of Guadalcanal was brutal and absolute. The jungle favored no one, but it respected simplicity. Fade to black. In the silence that follows, one truth begins to form. In the Pacific, the oldest weapon in the arsenal had found its perfect war. Before the Pacific War began, Japan believed it understood combat. Its army was trained in precision, discipline, and above all, spirit. The doctrine that shaped an entire generation of soldiers was not written in mathematics or metallurgy, but in philosophy. Battles, they believed, were won not by weapons, but by will. From the earliest days of training, recruits were molded into extensions of a single ideal, that courage could overcome any enemy. Each morning began with bayonet drills, lunges repeated until muscle and mind merged into instinct. Instructors barked not commands, but oaths of spirit. The rifle, to them, was more than steel and wood. It was the soldier's soul made visible. A man's honor was measured by how close he fought, not how far he could shoot. The bayonet charge became ritual, the physical expression of faith. In China, it had worked. Against unprepared defenders, the sight of hundreds of men rushing forward with fixed steel and unbroken voices shattered morale. Japanese officers mistook this success for proof that the human spirit could master even the modern battlefield. They called it Saishin, the doctrine of spiritual force. But Saishin met something new in the jungles of the Pacific, a weapon that refused to acknowledge its existence. The American shotgun did not fight in formations or wait for courage to cross open ground. It was patient, hidden, and absolute. At 5 yards, spirit had no meaning. One pull of the trigger rendered belief irrelevant. Reports from the front began to disturb Tokyo. Entire squads had vanished in seconds, their bayonets never raised. Officers described it with disbelief, an invisible death that punished bravery itself. The weapon did not wound or challenge. It ended. For Marines, the irony was impossible to ignore. They believed war was decided by will, one said. We brought science instead. The phrase spread quietly through the ranks, not mockery, but recognition. The battlefield had changed, and the age of spirit was dying beneath the weight of reason. The cult of the bayonet had survived centuries. In the Pacific, it took only one campaign to prove its extinction. Fade to black, in the steaming dark of the jungle, the rifle of tradition would meet the machinery of adaptation, and the outcome would not be philosophical. Between wars, the shotgun was nearly forgotten. To an army obsessed with modernization, it seemed crude, a relic of farmers and policemen, not soldiers. The new generation of officers trusted rifles, machine guns, and mechanized firepower. They measured progress by distance, by the precision of a scope or the velocity of a bullet. In that arithmetic, the shotgun had no place. When the 1930s gave way to global crisis, the United States entered war with warehouses full of memories. Among them, racks of old Winchester Model 1897 and Model 1912 trench guns. They were relics of a different kind of war. France, 1918, mud, trenches, and close-quarters chaos. Weapons for when the enemy was not across a field, but within a breath. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The illusion of predictable war vanished overnight. The U.S. Army and Marine Corps began to scour their arsenals, asking a simple question: what worked, not what was elegant? And from the dust of forgotten crates came the shotgun once more. Its steel was oiled, its wood polished, its bayonet lugs refitted. The old weapon, once dismissed as primitive, was reissued to fight in the most modern war mankind had ever waged. Factories revived production lines frozen since the First World War. Winchester, Ithaca, and Remington built new models, shortening barrels, reinforcing pumps, and machining heat shields to survive tropical corrosion. The weapon's design, already half a century old, required almost no modification. It was proof of an engineering truth often lost in progress. Perfection needs no revision. In training camps across America, recruits quickly learned its secret. The shotgun did not require distance or calculation, or even light. In dense vegetation, it was faster than thought. At 20 feet, it was final. What it lacked in range, it compensated for in certainty. Every Marine who shouldered it in mock battle knew instinctively this was a weapon for close worlds, for unseen enemies. When those same men stepped into the jungles of the Pacific, they found what the theorists never had. The range of war had collapsed. Visibility was measured in seconds. Ambush was constant. There, amid the heat and insects and darkness, the old gun found its element again. The weapon America had nearly forgotten had found its new war, not in the open fields of Europe, but in the claustrophobic heart of the Pacific, where every step could end in an instant. Fade to black, and in that darkness, the next lesson begins. That survival in the jungle was not about invention, but remembering. In the Pacific, distance disappeared. The jungle erased the concept of range. Trees became walls, vines became camouflage, and vision ended at 30 yards. For soldiers trained on rifle ranges and firing lines, it was a different world entirely. Marksmanship no longer decided survival. Reflex did. In that claustrophobic space, the rules of warfare inverted. Precision became a liability. A man could not aim when the enemy emerged 3 feet away from shadow. A gun that required breath control and line of sight was useless. What mattered now was speed, the time between recognition and action. The shotgun existed entirely within that moment. Its pattern of lead, 9 pellets spreading in a tight cone, turned chance into certainty. One pull of the trigger covered an entire doorway, a jungle path, a clearing. Where a rifleman might spend 5 rounds to find a target, the shotgun needed one. Each shell equaled an entire magazine in consequence. Commanders noticed. Platoons began to adapt their structure around it. In every squad, 2 or 3 men carried shotguns, forming a vanguard that moved first into on unknown terrain. When ambushes erupted, they didn't fall back. They fired forward. The spread of buckshot punched through undergrowth, cutting both cover and confusion. What had once been fear became geometry, distance, angle, and probability. The shotgun reduced war to its simplest equation. If the enemy was close, he would not leave. Tacticians called it jungle mathematics. Invisibility was constant, reaction time was measured in heartbeats, and success belonged to whoever understood proximity. The weapon didn't demand accuracy, it rewarded instinct, the natural rhythm of movement and muscle memory. Soldiers learned to trust their senses again, not their optics. Doctrines shifted overnight. Patrols stopped holding ground, they flowed through it. Move, fire, vanish became the mantra of survival. Firefights were not fought for territory, but for time, for seconds of advantage in a world where the jungle devoured both sound and sight. The Pacific taught an uncomfortable truth. Complexity fails where chaos reigns. The weapon of the future, it turned out, was one that belonged to the past. Fade to black. And in that silence, the next challenge begins: how to refine instinct into innovation. In the Pacific, adaptation was survival. Manuals were written in Washington, but doctrine was rewritten in the mud. For the Marines, the jungle itself became a teacher, and the shotgun, its favored pupil. Issued weapons arrived pristine, coated in oil and optimism. Within days, they bore the marks of necessity. Men began altering their shotguns, not out of rebellion, but instinct. The long barrels designed for open combat were sawed down to 20 inches, trading range for speed. Every inch removed meant quicker aim, quicker reaction, and one more man alive after contact. Heat shields, drilled and improvised, appeared along barrels to keep hands from burning after rapid fire. Leather slings, designed for parade ground neatness, were replaced with jungle webbing that wouldn't rot in humidity. A weapon once engineered for European trenches was evolving, cell by cell, into a creature of the Pacific. Each Marine became part gunsmith, part alchemist. Ammunition belts expanded, slung across chests like lifelines. Every shell a deliberate choice between buckshot for spread or slug for precision. They cleaned their guns with rags torn from shirts, stripped mud from the pumps with the edge of bayonets, and carried extra shells in waterproof tins meant for rations. The shotgun, simple in form, thrived because it demanded so little and returned so much. Field reports soon revealed something commanders hadn't measured on paper: morale. Units issued shotguns fought with new confidence. A man holding one didn't fear ambush. He welcomed it. The weapon restored a kind of control that the jungle had stolen. "It gave us confidence," one veteran recalled. "It was a weapon for men, not manuals." To the officers, this was more than sentiment. It was a measurable edge. Morale determined reaction, and reaction determined who lived long enough to shoot first. Soldiers treated their shotguns not as equipment, but as companions. Extensions of instinct that didn't need calibration, only trust. The weapon's design philosophy, short, reliable, unpretentious, mirrored the character of the men who carried it. It didn't symbolize power, it symbolized readiness. Each modification was a quiet act of rebellion against complexity, proof that the simplest tools, in capable hands, could outthink the machinery of empire. In the jungle, the gunsmiths were not in factories. They were in foxholes, learning that war doesn't reward invention. It rewards adaptation. Fade to black. And in the next chapter, That adaptation would be tested in the kind of storm only the Pacific could conjure. January 1944, Cape Gloucester, New Britain. The jungle was more swamp than land, a suffocating maze of rain, heat, and rot. The Marines who landed there stepped not onto soil, but into a living organism. Every vine clung, every root swallowed boots whole. Rifles rusted overnight, ammunition clumped with water. It was a battlefield that punished both movement and hesitation. Visibility was nearly zero. Even in daylight, the horizon ended at 20 feet. The sound of insects drowned orders. The rain erased footprints before they formed. In such a place, the difference between life and death was not range, but instinct. When the Japanese counterattacked, they came from nowhere, a whisper that became a scream. Patrols appeared from the undergrowth, bayonets glinting like shards of lightning. Machine guns jammed in the mud. Grenades rolled uselessly in the swamp. The first wave struck hard, certain the Americans could not return fire. But the Marines did not need sight. They had sound. Shotgun teams moved forward, cutting through the downpour. The first blast cracked like a thunderclap, the second like an echo from beneath the earth. Each shot was not aimed, but felt. The pellets tore through leaves, branches, and flesh alike, turning the jungle's concealment against its defenders. The Japanese formations collapsed before they even realized what had hit them. To the men in the swamp, the effect was surreal. The air itself seemed to explode, sound reflecting off trees, bouncing through the canopy, magnifying each discharge into a rolling wall of thunder. To the attackers, it was as if the forest had turned hostile. There was no muzzle flash to aim at, no rhythm to predict, only chaos. Japanese reports later described the experience with disbelief. Enemy uses a weapon that fills the air with death. They had faced mortars, grenades, and heavy machine guns before. But this was different. The shotgun didn't bombard or suppress. It consumed space. Within its range, survival was statistical, not personal. When the rain finally eased, the battlefield was quiet again, eerily so. The Marines emerged from the fog, pumping fresh shells into chambers slick with rain. Around them, the swamp seemed to exhale. What had just occurred was not a contest of firepower, but of adaptation. The Japanese had brought courage and doctrine, the Americans brought physics and instinct. The outcome was inevitable. It was not volume that mattered, it was certainty. Fade to black. In the next chapter, night itself would become their battlefield, and the shotgun, their only light. VV night in the Pacific was not absence of light, it was presence of fear. Beneath the canopy, even the moon could not reach. The air hung thick with humidity and silence, broken only by the distant hiss of rain or the slow shifting of unseen things. For soldiers, it was the hour when the jungle truly came alive. Japanese infantry had long mastered the art of night warfare. Trained to move soundlessly through darkness, they slipped past sentries, cut communications, and vanished again before dawn. They called it infiltration, war conducted like a shadow. For months, these tactics terrorized Allied camps. Every rustle became a warning, every sound could mean death. But by late 1943, the balance began to shift. The Marines had learned the jungle's rhythm, and they had found a weapon that could speak its language. The shotgun required no moonlight, no careful sighting down a barrel. Its spread of shot turned the darkness itself into a weapon. Where the rifleman hesitated, the shotgunner reacted. One sound, a metallic pump, and the blackness erupted. It didn't need precision, it only needed direction. Patrols began to move differently. They walked in silence, communicating with touch instead of words. Every few yards they stopped, listening, sensing. Then came movement, a twig snapping, a breath too loud, The jungle exhaled, and the first blast split the night apart. One pull of the trigger cleared 10 yards of darkness. The second made sure nothing remained. Japanese infiltration squads soon discovered that their greatest advantage had become their worst trap. Their courage, their willingness to crawl within meters of the enemy, now placed them directly in the weapon's domain. "They crept toward us," one Marine remembered, "but we had the dark on our side." The effect was psychological as much as physical. To the Japanese, it felt as if the Americans could see in the dark, as if the jungle itself had turned traitor. To the Marines, it felt like power reclaimed. The weapon gave them certainty where none should exist. In a war defined by chaos, that certainty mattered more than range or rank. The sound of a shotgun at night was not just a report. It was punctuation, a final word in a conversation no one wanted to have. Even when silence returned, it did not feel peaceful. It felt conditional, as though the next pull of the trigger could summon thunder from the black. Fear spread faster than bullets. The infiltrators began to hesitate. Their attacks grew sporadic, their retreats hurried. The jungle, once Japan's greatest ally, now turned against them, echoing their movements, amplifying their errors. What had been their weapon of choice became their grave. In the darkness of the Pacific, technology had not triumphed. Instinct had. The simplest firearm on the battlefield had outwitted an army built on discipline and stealth. Fade to black, for in the coming battles, that lesson would only deepen. The war of shadows was over. What followed would be a war of reckoning. By late 1944, the jungle war had become a mirror, reflecting not strategy, but belief. For the Imperial Japanese Army, that belief had always been clear. Honor was stronger than firepower, and courage could overcome any weapon. For the Americans, experience had stripped illusions away. In the Pacific, victory belonged not to ideals, but to adaptation. Across the islands, from Bougainville to Peleliu, the pattern repeated. Japanese infantry, low on supplies but rich in conviction, launched their final gambit, the Banzai Charge. Hundreds of men rose from the jungle mist, bayonets glinting, shouting into the smoke. It was not madness, but a ritual, one last appeal to the gods of courage. They advanced with the confidence of centuries behind them. The response was a sound they had not prepared for. Shotguns opened up at 20 yards. The first volley struck like lightning. The second erased formation entirely. What had begun as glory turned to ruin in seconds. In the space where honor once lived, only chaos remained. The jungle, dense, wet, unfeeling, swallowed their cries. The brutality of the shotgun was not in its design. It was in its intimacy. Rifles could kill at distance. Mortars could destroy unseen. But the shotgun demanded proximity. It required the soldier to face what he was ending. Each pull of the trigger was not mechanical. It was personal. The war that Japan had imagined, one of discipline and spirit, dissolved into something raw and immediate. Survivors spoke of it later with disbelief. "We did not know such weapons existed," one officer admitted after the war. They had trained against rifles, drilled against bayonets, rehearsed courage against pain. But nothing prepared them for a weapon that turned bravery itself into vulnerability. The closer they came, the faster they died. American commanders, observing from rear positions, noticed something different. The shotgun wasn't just lethal, it was efficient. Engagements ended quicker. Ammunition use dropped. Morale stayed high. Units armed with shotguns survived longer and advanced farther through terrain, where machine guns jammed and carbines misfired. The weapon demanded no ceremony, no pretense. It was pure function, and function, in the jungle, was survival. This was the turning point of the Pacific Campaign, not marked by a single battle, but by a shift in thinking. For centuries, armies had equated progress with complexity, but in the mud and fog of the tropics, simplicity had the final word. What the Japanese called barbaric, the Americans called practical, and what began as an improvisation became doctrine. As night fell across another silent ridge, the smell of gunpowder lingered in the air. The Marines wiped their weapons clean, methodical, and calm. The Japanese, in scattered pockets of resistance, prepared again for morning, unaware that honor no longer had meaning at 10 yards. In the jungle, simplicity had outsmarted ideology. Fade to black. But in the next campaign, the weapon would become more than an advantage. It would become a symbol. By 1944, the shotgun had evolved beyond a weapon. It had become a presence, a companion that soldiers trusted more than strategy, more than luck. In the humid stillness of the Pacific, where the enemy could be 5 feet away and unseen, it was the one tool that never betrayed them. Marines began to carry it not by assignment, but by instinct. Those who could get one did. Those who couldn't envied those who did. The Winchester Model 97, or Model 12, pump action, reliable, uncompromising, hung from the shoulder like an unspoken guarantee. To hold it was to feel certainty in a place that offered none. At Peleliu, where the air shimmered with heat and stank of coral dust, riflemen struggled to find their targets. The enemy moved underground, firing from tunnels and hidden trenches. For most weapons, it was an invisible war, fought against echoes. But when the shotgun fired, it ended the argument. A single blast into an opening turned silence into resolution. It was a weapon that didn't need to see in order to understand. In the caves of Okinawa, the pattern repeated. Tunnels ran like veins through the hills, twisting, intersecting, impossible to predict. Grenades could clear a chamber, but not always the corners. Flame could drive men out, but not every time. The shotgun required neither distance nor delay. Marines moved into the darkness, pump handles sliding with rhythm, each click a declaration of control. At 5 yards, there was no uncertainty, only finality. Even Japanese snipers, once the ghosts of the tree line, began to fear it. The weapon's spread was wide enough to punish movement, its reach deceptive, its recoil commanding. A single Marine, armed with one, could silence an entire section of forest. It wasn't just power that made the shotgun feared, it was what it represented. It stripped combat down to its essence: man, weapon, reaction. There were no optics, no calculations, no waiting for permission. It gave soldiers the power to act first, and the confidence that when they did, it would matter. In that sense, it didn't just save lives. It returned agency to men fighting a war that often felt uncontrollable. One veteran described it simply: in that jungle, it was the only thing that listened to you. To the Americans, it became a badge of calm amid chaos, a reminder that mastery didn't always mean complexity. To the Japanese, it was something else entirely, an unknowable weapon that defied their code, one that replaced courage with physics and met devotion with inevitability. When the battles ended and the jungle fell silent once more, the weapon remained where it had always belonged, in human hands, not machines. It was not precise, not elegant, but utterly decisive. Fade to black. But the war's philosophy had one more test ahead. The weapon had broken fear. Next, it would break doctrine itself. By the end of 1944, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted, not only in numbers, but in belief. The Imperial Japanese Army, once feared for its discipline and ferocity, found itself fighting a war that no longer resembled the one it had prepared for. The doctrine of spirit over science, the creed that courage could triumph over technology, had begun to collapse under the weight of reality. In theory, The Japanese infantryman was an apex product of training and tradition. His rifle, the Arisaka Type 99, was long, precise, and beautifully crafted, but built for open fields, not suffocating jungle. Its bolt action demanded time the Pacific no longer allowed. Every reload, every hesitation, became a sentence. Against the shotgun, it wasn't range that mattered. It was reaction. The Americans moved differently now. Patrols no longer crept nervously through the brush. They advanced with quiet confidence, barrels lowered until the moment came. The first shot always decided the fight, and it was rarely fired by the enemy. The jungle had taught its lesson well. In close combat, the fastest hand ruled the field. Japanese commanders tried to adapt, but innovation requires more than courage. It demands resources. By late 1944, Japan had neither. Ammunition was scarce, logistics failing. Engineers proposed lighter rifles, faster-firing carbines, even shotguns of their own. But the factories were silent, bombed or starving. For an empire built on pride, the inability to evolve became its most fatal wound. The psychological balance inverted. Where once Japanese soldiers struck from the shadows, now they feared the dark. Where once they ambushed, they hesitated. Marines reported strange encounters, small enemy patrols spotted but never attacking, eyes reflecting from the undergrowth, waiting for a chance that never came. The hunter had become the hunted. By the time the campaign reached the Philippines, the shift was undeniable. The Japanese began to avoid close-range combat entirely. Bunkers replaced charges, traps replaced movement. The fighting grew defensive, desperate, slower. Their officers still spoke of honor, but their men no longer believed it would save them. The sound of the shotgun had rewritten their understanding of fear. It wasn't the weapon alone that broke the doctrine. It was what it revealed. The Imperial Army's strength had always been its faith, in discipline, in the sword, in the will to die well. But the shotgun was indifferent to faith. It made bravery obsolete. It showed that war, stripped of ceremony, belonged to those who learned faster, not those who felt deeper. When the empire finally fell, it did so not from lack of soldiers, but from lack of imagination. The same simplicity that had once been dismissed as barbaric had proven to be genius. And in that irony lay the war's quiet truth, that even the proudest ideals can crumble when they refuse to evolve, fade to black. The empire's warriors had not been defeated by firepower alone, but by a new kind of understanding, one that would shape the post-war world to come. By the summer of 1945, the noise had stopped. Across the Pacific, guns were cleaned for the last time, their barrels cooled by silence instead of rain. The men who had carried them, now leaner, older, quieter, began the long journey home. Among their packs and memories was a weapon that had never sought glory but had earned reverence, the shotgun. It had served without ceremony. No medals were pinned to its steel, no parades announced its triumphs. It simply did its work, as it always had, up close, without hesitation, without fail. In Okinawa's caves, in the swamps of New Guinea, on the slopes of Peleliu, it had been both shield and sword. Its design had not changed in decades, yet its effect had reshaped the idea of war itself. When the fighting ended, Marines and soldiers disassembled their guns with the same deliberate care they had shown before each battle. Hands that once pumped shells into chambers now polished the wood, checked the bolts, and folded the slings. Each weapon was returned to its crate, marked for shipment. Home, but not celebration. For most, it would spend the next decades in darkness, sealed in armories or sold as surplus to hunters who would never know its history. In reports and archives, it appeared only as a footnote, Ikuran 12-gauge, trench, or riot model. But among the men who had used it, the memory carried weight. "It saved us when nothing else could," one veteran said. To them, it had been more than a firearm. It was presence, immediate, unpretentious, absolute. When technology failed, it remained faithful. When fear spread, it answered with finality. Other weapons had defined the war in spectacle: the bombers, the tanks, the aircraft carriers. The shotgun defined it in intimacy. It was the weapon of eye contact, of breath, of heartbeats measured between trigger pulls. In the jungle's suffocating closeness, it had become something elemental, not invention, but instinct made metal. And yet, when peace came, it vanished. New doctrines prized distance, automation, and control. The future belonged to weapons that killed from far away. The shotgun, too human, too near, was quietly retired, replaced by rifles that promised precision and detachment. Still, its echo lingered, not in sound, but in the memory of those who had relied on it when nothing else stood between them and death. For them, it was the humblest of instruments, yet the purest form of war's truth, that in the end, survival belongs not to the most advanced, but to the most adaptable. The weapon returned home, but the lesson remained abroad, buried in the soil of 1,000 jungles, waiting for a world that might one day remember what it had taught, fade to black. But soon, strategists would rediscover its simplicity, and with it, the forgotten art of fighting close. After the war, the world of military science turned its gaze backward. In laboratories and lecture halls, tacticians re-examined the Pacific campaigns, searching for patterns, searching for meaning. Amid the vast machinery of global conflict, one truth stood out with uncomfortable clarity: the smallest weapon had often made the largest difference. In reports filed by officers and engineers, the shotgun appeared again and again, not as a relic, but as a riddle. It had no optics, no complex parts, no modern pedigree. Yet in the chaos of the jungle, it had outperformed weapons that represented entire nations' research and budgets. The conclusion was quietly revolutionary. Terrain, not technology, decides innovation. The jungle had been a ruthless teacher. It punished over-engineering, mocked precision, and rewarded adaptability. Rifles that could hit a target 500 yards away meant little when visibility ended at 20. Machines jammed in mud, scopes fogged and failed. But the shotgun, pump, aim, fire, never faltered. Its simplicity was not a limitation, it was the secret to survival. Military theorists called it contextual supremacy. Weapons were only as effective as the environments that shaped them. The Pacific proved that complexity, when divorced from circumstance, became fragility. The shotgun, unrefined and unpretentious, fit perfectly into a world of roots, shadows, and split-second violence. It was proof that evolution in war was not always forward. Sometimes it looped back to what already worked. In the decades that followed, the lesson resurfaced. In Vietnam, soldiers found themselves once again surrounded by dense foliage and invisible enemies. The shotgun returned, unchanged, unmodernized, as if time had waited for it. In the villages of the Mekong Delta and the tunnels of Cu Chi, its familiar sound echoed once more, bridging 2 generations of war. Later, in Iraq and Afghanistan, American patrols carried the same weapon through narrow alleys and doorways, proof that even in the age of drones and satellites, there remained moments when the old rules still applied. Designers tried to reinvent it, to give it polymers, rails, and modular parts, but the essence stayed the same. The weapon did not evolve because it didn't need to. It had already achieved the rarest form of progress: sufficiency. What others called primitive, history now called perfect. In an era obsessed with advancement, the shotgun's legacy became an act of quiet defiance. It reminded those who studied war that power does not always lie in innovation, but in understanding. That simplicity is not weakness, but clarity, the ability to do exactly what is required. Nothing more and nothing less. Fade to black, because the final lesson of the jungle was not about the weapon at all, but about memory. Progress, it turned out, could mean remembering. When the first intelligence reports reached Japanese field officers, describing Americans armed with pump-action shotguns, they dismissed them outright. To them, it sounded absurd. The shotgun was a farmer's implement, a hunter's toy. In their minds, the imperial soldier was a warrior of discipline and steel, not a hunter in the woods. They laughed at the thought of modern armies reverting to such crude tools. But the jungle did not respect theory. It devoured formations, silenced orders, and rewrote every rule of engagement. In that world of shadows and heat, it was not the modern rifle that ruled. It was instinct, and instinct favored the man whose weapon needed no distance to decide a fight. At first, the Japanese believed it was an act of desperation, that the Americans had simply run out of proper arms. Yet, battle after battle, their laughter faded into silence. Patrols vanished in the undergrowth without warning. The sound that followed, a single blast, deep and percussive, became the jungle's punctuation mark. Captured diaries told the same story. "Enemy uses a weapon like thunder," one officer wrote. "We cannot see it, only what it leaves behind." The weapon they once mocked now haunted their nights. It was not refinement that conquered them. It was raw efficiency, delivered by hands that had learned to survive rather than impress. The irony was complete. In a war that had birthed jet fighters and carrier fleets, it was a gun designed before the Great Depression that dictated the tempo of survival. The Winchester Model 1897, a relic of trench warfare, had found its second life not in factories, but in the hands of men who understood its language. Simple, mechanical, final. The empire that had worshipped the bayonet found itself undone by buckshot. The rifle that symbolized ceremony met a weapon that symbolized certainty. In the jungle, there was no room for pageantry. Every corner, every vine, every step demanded something faster, rougher, and more honest. By war's end, no one was laughing. The shotgun had earned its silence, not through fear, but through respect. It proved a quiet truth that armies often forget. Progress means nothing if it cannot survive contact with reality. In the age of machines, it was humanity's oldest rhythm, breath, motion, instinct, that decided who lived. They laughed at the old guns once. They never laughed again.